but yeah, I've been on gross.
Okay, I thought we'd get started. So thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Barnali Choudhury, and I am the director of the Nathanson Center, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. We'll start with our land acknowledgement. So we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble speaking today, nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders from Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So our talk today is called Mountains Beyond Mountains, the challenges for non-state actors to contribute to climate governance. And we have an international cast of characters here today. I'll start with our first presenter, who will be Professor Ben Richardson, who's a professor of environmental law at the University of Tasmania and is joining us here from Australia. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Ben. We will also be featuring people online as well. So we have Professor Christopher Waters, who is a professor at the University of Windsor and the former dean, if I recall correctly. We have Konstantia Koutouki, who is a professor at UDM, and we have our very own Hassan Ahmad, who is a new professor here at Osgoode, who will also be speaking. Each commentator will be speaking for 15 minutes, and I will be timekeeping. Yes, okay. And I guess we can begin with Professor Richardson. So whenever you're ready, you have the floor. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you, Barnali, for those gracious remarks, and also thanks to Leil, Venetia, and other staff at the Nathanson Center for hosting this event. I'm also a former professor of Osgoode Law. I was teaching here for 8 years some time ago, and I'm delighted to be back, and particularly with the wonderful new building that you have. I'm going to talk about the role of non-state actors, specifically landholders, and specifically rural landholders. They could be farmers, they could be back to landers, tree changers, even Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to give a personal account because I'm going to talk a bit about my own experience as a rural landholder engaged in climate-conscious nature conservation. So this is a paper based on my own observations about some of the challenges of rural landholders playing a role in nature conservation. It's also a project that reflects a research grant that I'm leading, which is from the Australian Research Council. It's a 3-year project examining the role of conservation covenants as a tool, a legal tool, to get landholders to play a bigger role in nature conservation. Now, property law students here at Osgoode, you'd be familiar with the Freehold Covenant. I'm going to talk specifically about a statutory version of that called the Conservation Covenant. Next slide, Venetia. So the starting point for this is to look at the global context. This is not a story simply about what individuals are doing in places like Canada and Australia, rural landholders conserving nature, but there's a really significant global framework, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, that was adopted in December 2022. And what it sets out is known informally as the 30 by 30 targets, and that is that we want by the end of this decade to have 30% of the world's land mass and oceans protected as national parks and reserves, and to have 30% of areas that are ecologically degraded under active restoration, and that's about 350 million hectares. Now, when we look at the existing areas that are protected around the world, the latest data from late 2024 is that we have 17.6% of the world's land that's protected in parks and reserves, and 8.4% protected of the oceans in marine parks and reserves. Now, there's quite a gap to fill and a very short amount of time to do so. When we look at Australia and Canada, just to illustrate at a national level the gap, in Canada, 14% of the land mass is now in parks and reserves. It's only halfway in the 5 years left. Australia, the number is 20%. Now, in order to try to close that gap, we're going to have to look at the role of private landholders. Next slide, Venetia. And I'll explain why. I mean, this is some images from the property that I owned. I bought a property when I moved to Tasmania in 2015 from Canada I bought 66 acres of forest, and I put a conservation covenant on it in order to protect that area. It also had a small holiday home, a writer's retreat, which I found very conducive to work on environmental law. And I held on to that property for 5 years. And out of that experience, I got some really interesting insights as to, well, what can private landholders do and not do? And let me just come back to this proposition about why private landholders are important to achieve the 30 by 30 targets. And I'll look at some data on land tenure from Australia and Canada. Next slide, Venetia. So if you look at this slide here, this shows land tenure around Australia. Now, the bits to understand that are significant, it's the light blue and the purple and the crimson and the red. Those represent private property. 60% of Australia is either owned privately or managed privately. She's asking if you
I'm just asking, can you maximize the slide?
Just asking if you could put it in full view, is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So 60% of Australia is either owned or managed privately. Now, if we look at the next slide.
I don't know why it won't let me start the slideshow.
Just can move it conventionally. We don't lose that. So 60% of the...
Get the okay at the top.
Oh,
I think.
perfect.
Okay.
There we go.
Just
Now we're
Next slide.
there.
much better.
Okay, so go to the next slide. Now, what this slide shows, and keep in mind the previous slide, it shows areas of Australia where biodiversity is underprotected in parks and reserves or other mechanisms. Now, those coloured areas correlate very strongly with the areas that were blue, pink, purple, crimson in the previous slide. So what that tells us that if we're going to achieve representative protection of different types of ecosystems around Australia, we're going to need to enrol the private sector into that. Now, if we look at the Canadian context, next slide, we look at Ontario. In Ontario, the area that is shaded pink crimson at the bottom is the area of privately held land. 90% of the province is held by the Crown, and included within that is Aboriginal land, of course. So in Canada, there's a much smaller proportion of land that is held privately compared to Australia. I mean, it's roughly around, the data that I've seen is 11% of Canada is owned privately. Now, you might think, well, therefore in Canada, private landholders commensurately are not going to have such a significant role in meeting 30 by 30 targets compared to Australia. But if we look at the next slide, Venetia, what it shows is areas like Australia where there's underrepresentation of ecosystems in national parks and reserves. And you can see that they're very concentrated at the bottom of the southern Ontario, around the Golden Horseshoe and other areas of high population concentration. If you look at the next slide, what it does is shows around Canada areas shaded in the red and related where we have the highest number of species at risk. Just to give you one example, under the Species Risk Act, which is the federal threatened species legislation, 1/3 of all plant species that are listed are predominantly populating areas of private property. So the takeaway from these slides, and that's my last slide, is that private landholders, both in Canada and Australia, have to play an important role in nature conservation if we're going to meet 30 by 30 targets. Now, the instrument that's available legally to do so is called the Conservation Covenant. It is created under bespoke legislation to overcome the limitations of the common law variety and the variety in equity. It can be held in gross, it can have positive and negative duties. And it's essentially created by an agreement voluntarily between a landholder and a government conservation agency or a delegated authority. So come to my own experience. When I acquired this property in Tasmania, it was just zoned mixed land use. It had no particular level of environmental protection under relevant regulations. It didn't have a covenant. I sensed that it had really significant conservation values. And I had a scientist from the Tasmanian Land Conservancy come out and do a survey, and he did. And it showed what I thought. It was high in species, some of who are listed as endangered, like the Tasmanian devil. And so I then put an application into the government's agency that manages covenants to say, well, I want to put a covenant on it. And I got one secured. And it contained fairly non-difficult terms for me. Don't graze animals, don't cut trees, don't use agricultural chemicals, don't build roads, There was a small area where there was a holiday home that was left intact. There were some minor positive duties: get rid of feral pests, get rid of weeds if they exist. In terms of benefits I received, apart from the feel-good factor of playing a role, I had a minor reduction in property taxes. Over the 5 years I had it, there was only once that government inspectors came out to check what I was up to. Two ladies came, they gave me 2 weeks' notice. We had a leisurely walk through the forest. We took photos and I got a pat on the back. I sold it in 2020, and I'm confident that the covenant will remain there in perpetuity because covenants are designed to exist forever. Now, one could walk away from that experience and say, wow, this is just amazing. Landholders with privilege, as I am, are able to buy land and conserve it and protect it like a national park, because that's essentially what you're doing, creating a private park, despite changes in ownership that will happen in years to come. And it tends to dovetail with a lot of the theoretical literature we see about the role of private NGOs in addressing the environmental goals, top grassroots, collaborative, involving the civil society, multiple actors playing a role, mobilizing local knowledge, local landholders. So it all sounds pretty good. But from my experience, there's actually 5 major problems. And this is what I'll finish up with, just to distill 5 key problems that I think any future mobilisation of covenants in Canada and Australia and other jurisdictions will have to address. The first thing is they tend to be used on spare land. The land that I had was rugged bush, rocky, completely unsuitable for farming, unsuitable for logging, unsuitable for mining as far as I could tell. If you want to get a farmer in prime land in southern Ontario to take on a conservation covenant, I bet you the chances are very, very remote. They're very remote in Australia. They're not going to allow prime economic land to be taken out of production and to be used for conservation purposes, which means a ban on development. So there's a bit of a problem. It's only targeting the low-hanging fruit, this spare land that people can't otherwise use. The second problem is that conservation covenants are designed to conserve land of high conservation value. But the problem is, with the 30 by 30 targets, we need to be restoring degraded land. You can't meet eligibility criteria for a covenant if the land you've got is in a crappy degraded state. So we need to sort of reconfigure covenants to be able to target the land that needs to be important for, like, say, habitat corridors across fragmented landscapes, so wildlife can migrate and move and adapt to climate change. So there's a real problem with covenants. They're not set up to deal with that sort of positive, active stewardship of the land, and you won't even meet that threshold criteria. The third problem is lack of reciprocity. When we think of contract law and property law, we think of deals that are made, between 2 neighbouring landholders. One benefits, one burdens, and a covenant is negotiated between them. When you've got a conservation covenant like the one I opted into, it's done on the assumption that I'm doing it for altruistic reasons. It's a gift to society. I put my land under a covenant, and I'm not concerned about any ramifications or losses because I just care about nature. What were the economic losses? They weren't great. When I applied to get a covenant, my bank had to send out a valuer to look at the land because it was a mortgage. Of course, the bank won't approve it because it's got the property as security. And the valuer said, look, having a covenant on your property, Ben, it's going to diminish the financial value if you were to sell it by 1 to 2%. I didn't think that was a big hit to take. But if it was prime agricultural land, it would be a lot worse. Now, the problem with lack of reciprocity is you don't get any real significant benefits from government. You don't get massive reductions in property taxes or capital gains tax credits, let alone technical aid and assistance. No one ever came out to my property, tried to educate me about how to care for nature. And I was lucky. It was a high quality, high intact area. I didn't need to restore it. I didn't need to spend money. I could sit back and enjoy it. The fourth problem is uniformity. Governments are loath to create bespoke covenants. They want a one-size-fits-all model. So when I was negotiating with the Tasmanian government about, what's going to be in the covenant, I was told, take it or leave it. This is the standard agreement. You either buy into it or you don't. The only area for the negotiation is which parts of the land will have a covenant and which won't. It's not worth their while to have landowner by landowner negotiation. So there are transaction costs if we want to involve non-state actors in environmental governance, is the takeaway. And the last comment is climate change. But this is significant. When the inspectors came to my property, we went for the tour, they pointed out to me, they said, Ben, look at those trees over there. They're suffering from ginger syndrome. I said, what's that? They said that means those trees at some point in recent years suffered heat stress. There was a period of very intense warming, and the trees which had these ginger streaks are dying, and it's a result of climate change. Now, that covenant offered zero protection against climate change, and there's nothing that I can do about it as a landholder. So the problem with covenants is they assume this passive conservation model. They're fixed in perpetuity, they don't change. Yet climate change adaptation demands we have a much more nimble, flexible approach to managing nature. I don't know how I could possibly do that as a landholder. So going forward, I'm leading this Australia Research Council grant that's designed to deal with those 5 problems. So I'm working with a team of 5, and although we're focused on Australia, we are looking at Canada and a few other jurisdictions to say, how can we try to reform the regimes for covenants to allow us to achieve 21st century goals of climate adapted nature conservation in the 21st century to meet 3030 targets. That's all from me. Thank you.
Do you want to do questions at the end?
I thought we were doing them, do you want to take them
No,
all now? It's fine.
At the end.
Next up.
Yeah, sure. I can begin with, firstly, I want to echo Ben's comments and say thank you to the team from Nathanson for inviting me to what is a very important and interesting topic, and hopefully I can add something to it. As Ben was speaking, I was thinking I need a property in the forest where I can do some writing. So that was one thing. And then the other thing I was thinking about was the Tasmanian devil, going back to the cartoons I watched as a child. But very interesting looking at it from the perspective of landowners. Where my interest in climate governance comes in is looking at it from the perspective of how can we hold major carbon emitters throughout the world to account. And the most significant carbon emitters, and I won't mention a number of statistics. What I really want to talk about is a conceptual concept of corporate accountability when it comes to climate change, because the largest emitters of greenhouse gases continue to be large corporations in the extractive industries and the transportation industries. And so I want to point to 3 conceptual problems that I see when it comes to placing accountability. And you can look at that generally. The term accountability in business and human rights has really been taken to mean going after the revenues and profits of corporations, seeking compensation for wrongdoing. But you can look at accountability via regulatory prosecutions or otherwise. I see 3 conceptual problems, and there's others, but these are the 3 major ones, both in international climate change regimes and domestic climate change regimes. And I'll just summarize them first and then go into each of them in more detail. The first is, I think, an assumption that is made at both the international and domestic levels that governments are in fact the power brokers, the seminal and central decision-making authority that will dictate climate governance and the mitigation and adaptation to climate change in the future. And I'm not certain that I would push back against that assumption. The second conceptual problem is that climate liability against corporations is often analogized to previous attempts to hold large corporations to account for mass harms, particularly tobacco companies and pharmaceutical companies. And there are certain analogies there, without doubt, but there are certain differences between corporate climate accountability and accountability for tobacco-related or opioid-related harms. And the third is what I will term the attribution problem, not so much where we attribute greenhouse gas emissions to. There is a problem when it comes to that, and we've seen that in the litigation in Canada and otherwise, but the attribution problem in the sense that unlike past issues of corporate liability for mass harms, whether it's tobacco, whether it's oil and mining and human rights violations, or opioid-related accountability, we all contribute to climate change in one way or another. So it's not as clean in how we attribute accountability for climate-related harms. So let me go into each one of those. So one of my areas of interest is the history of corporate personhood, the history of corporations, and particularly transnational corporations. From the very beginning of European joint stock and chartered companies, there's always been this tension between government power and corporate power. You can look at the struggles for power that the British Crown had with the East India Company, the Dutch Crown had with the Dutch East India Company, and other European empires as well, and who would have decision-making authority in the areas of business that the corporation conducted. And this is true even today. If we look at just a contemporary, very contemporary example, starting next week, frankly, if you look at the US government's relationship with tech companies, it would be reductionist to say that one entity holds decision-making power vis-a-vis another entity when it comes to the different types of uses of energy that we have in our societies. There's a power sharing agreement, and power, I would say, is fluid among between government and corporations. We can't just say that one party dictates laws and policies, although on its face, it would appear that government has decision-making authority. The corporate lobby today and corporate decision-making power, and also the ongoing relationship between government and corporations, is something that I think we ignore too much when it comes to climate governance. If we look at international climate regimes, going back to the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, there has been this assumption that if we regulate and get buy-in from governments, that corporations will just follow suit, that as sub-sovereign actors, they will essentially follow what governments are doing. Now, the assumption behind that is that corporations are actually part of a state, that they fall, that Nathanson or Petro-Canada is part of Canada, that Shell or Chevron is part of the US, that BP is part of the UK, that corporations actually belong to states. And I think that factually is not necessarily true. If we look at corporations rather as these roaming, disembedded entities that kind of can go anywhere in the earth for profit-seeking activities, rather than being embedded to particular states, I think that is a truer representation of what corporations are and their relationship to state governments. There is a lot of flexibility that corporations have. They can invest anywhere in the world. They're not as embedded to a particular jurisdiction or a particular set of laws like governments are, and therefore they can evade laws. So as Vivian Kern puts it, they are both ubiquitous and anonymous at the same time. So their carbon emissions are furtive in a way that they're never really asked to come to the table when it comes to climate governance. So at the annual COP conferences, it is mostly governments that are involved in the negotiation, with the assumption that if governments come to agreements, then non-state actors will follow suit. But what that really is it's leaving behind and leaving aside powerful actors, and arguably the more powerful actors that are responsible for GHG emissions. So rather than looking at a power dynamic where governments control corporations or corporations are part of a particular state, we should look at the government-corporate relationship and the way the global political economy works as a relationship of mutual benefit, of complementarity, that the private sector and the public sector actually complement each other, and the private sector is more efficient, more powerful, better resourced. And if you don't believe me, you can call the Canada Revenue Agency and see how well you're, treated or responded to vis-a-vis if you, not that this is necessarily that much better as an example, if you call your phone company. Or my point is, private sector tends to be far better resourced and capable and efficient than the public sector is. So to assume that the power lies in government, and if governments make decisions, everything is just going to be, these collective action problems are going to be resolved, I think is an assumption that actually is not going to govern climate mitigation. So that's the first conceptual challenge I see. The second and the third are really about the psychology of climate change. I don't think there's enough attention paid to this. The second problem is what I would call the problem of false analogies. So climate liability or climate accountability toward corporations is different than accountability for cigarette companies in the past or opioid companies, pharmaceutical companies up until today. Whereas those activities, we could kind of carve out from society, we could actually scapegoat and to say that these are, you know, the sins of society or not necessarily central to our well-being or our way of life. If we look at if we look at climate change, it comes about through our day-to-day activities that are very difficult to change, whether it's from the food that we eat, the goods that we use, the clothes we wear. There's a psychology where it is very difficult to change the way we live our lives in order to mitigate climate change. If you know, I said, everybody in this room, if we, you know, all become vegetarian and we start a movement, we know, statistically, we know that will mitigate climate change. The maintenance of cattle and other farm products that go into our diets contribute significantly to climate change. Likewise, extracting minerals out of the earth, the technology that we use on a day-to-day basis, contributes significantly to climate change. But to alter that, we would need to change our lifestyles, and we would need to utilize clean energies far more than we currently do, which now there's a corporate lobby in the back of this as well that maintains our lifestyles. But there's a psychology that goes behind this that I would argue was not in place in such the same way when it came to cigarette companies, when it comes to opioid and pharmaceutical companies until today. We can carve out those activities far easier than we can for climate related impacts. How much time do I have? Okay, I got 3 minutes and 46 seconds to get through my third conceptual point, which is, and I think I can do it faster than that, to be honest. The attribution problem that I said that the way I'm describing it is not, you know, can we attribute particular GHG emissions to particular companies or particular actors? There have been studies that have attempted to do that. There's a study out of Oxford that has, you know, in a very detailed way looked at how much certain corporations contribute to the warming of the planet. What I am saying is the attribution problem is problematized with climate change because in some way or another, this is something we all contribute to. This is not a collective action problem in the same way that, you know, human rights violations abroad against extractive industries is, or that, you know, the mass harms caused by pharmaceutical or tobacco companies, where you can say, this is the wrongdoer, this is who we're going to go after to change their behavior. Again, there's a psychology behind this, that this is a collective action problem in the way that it is ubiquitous. Climate attribution for climate change is something that everybody, one way or another, contributes to, although the biggest corporations contribute far more than you and I do. But we foster that conduct. So there's a bit of a cycle that is hard to get out of. You know, you have the supply chain, you have consumers that continue to foment the production that we see throughout the world. And so that's what I want to get back to. There's a psychology of climate change that is quite difficult to adapt and turn away from overnight. And so with the second and third conceptual issues, whereas in the first one I said there is, you know, a power sharing rather than a top-down power structure between governments and corporations. For the second and third conceptual issues, I think there is a role to be played by government, by strong government that can push back on corporate misconduct, but that takes some bold steps. So I'm not saying I necessarily have the solutions to any of this, but hopefully that kind of lays out some of the conceptual issues that I see. Thank you.
Konstantia next? Just in my slides.
Yes, agree. Okay, so until basically yesterday, I was going to talk on something completely different. And so last night I sort of contacted Venetia and I said, never mind, I'm doing a 180. And I'm sure she sort of looked at the email like, oh boy, what is she doing now? And the reason for this is that I had an experience last week that made me think this is probably a good panel to discuss the sort of the role of universities in the whole climate governance dialogue and how incredibly difficult it is to have a dialogue in universities around this topic. So I knew this from before because I am what is known, and I didn't realize that there was a name for this, but I am what is known as a climate change optimist in the university circles. And so there are apparently climate change optimists, climate change sort of in between people, and climate change pessimists. So I've been told. And I sort of always knew that there was all this sort of difficulty in having conversations around this topic in a university setting. But since I became a vice dean at my faculty, I have seen it in a much more different way. And that is last week. So I have a call from a student who's at another faculty who is on the phone with me, sort of just going on this long tirade how she thinks she would like to change faculties and change universities and come to UDEM because she is not able to deal with a faculty at her faculty with regards to climate change, because that's what she wants to do her doctoral thesis on. And basically her thing is everybody's in this panic. Everybody's telling me like how they're sorry that they've put my future in danger, and how as a young person, I must really kind of feel weird about knowing that there is this sort of, knife constantly over my head, and that, how do I feel about my future as a young person, and so on and so forth. And she's sitting there and she says, I feel fine about my future. I feel like we have progressed enough in our thought patterns and in the way that we see climate change, and in the amount of people that are taking this seriously. And I think we have in place sort of a conceptual framework to move forward in a much more, I don't know how to say this, but in a quicker, faster pace that will lead us to an adaptability to climate change that is quite good. And I was like, okay. In the exact same day, I had a student come into my office from our own faculty that says, I want to change supervisors. And I was like, oh boy, okay, here we go. It says, my supervisor is completely not taking climate change seriously. They're going on and on about this sort of like, what's the business case for my proposal, for my thesis, and this and that and the other thing. And this person, a man in this case, says they're not understanding how precarious my future is. And I want to get this across in my thesis, and I don't think that's the right person to supervise me. And I just sort of sat there and I thought, okay, well, maybe we can just exchange and then everybody will be happy. But the point to this whole thing is that it sort of put the accent for me that there is this divergence between the different populations in universities of how we discuss and how we talk and the language we use with regards to climate change. And so this you find in the student populations, in and of themselves. And there, we're not really super surprised. Students tend to have a diverse way of thinking on a number of topics. And we've seen how that can be problematic in an environment, for instance, at UDEM, where we have 50,000 students. So you have 50,000 students, you're not exactly going to have a sort of uniform perspective on all topics, but it's still the same university, and the discussions need to be taken into consideration in that exact same institution. But where we also see it is between academics themselves, not necessarily, well, yes, within a particular faculty in and of itself. So in this case, the law faculty, but also between faculties. So when you have discussions where you have people that are implicated that are in public policy, as opposed to engineering, as opposed to biology, as opposed to law, social science, and so on and so forth, you have some very divergent ways of speaking about climate change. And so, I sort of entitled my presentation a balanced dialogue on climate governance, because it's that dialogue, it's the words you use, it's how you express yourself, it's all these things that need to be taken into consideration when we discuss being able to have these dialogues within a university setting. And so you see these sort of divergent opinions, not necessarily in the sense of climate change, we're all going to die, there is no such thing as climate change. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking that nuanced middle ground where some people are sort of over here and some are over there. This is not, like I said, the extremes. This is not what we're talking about. And how we go about having these discussions when you have a rather diverse middle is actually quite important in a university setting. And so I would like to sort of make the point by talking about a couple of projects that I've been involved in, where they have been very interdisciplinary in nature. So I tend to be quite often the sort of token legal person in different projects. And, you're there and they sort of assume that, especially in the Quebec context where, there's civil law is very important, that you're going to show up with your little red Code civil code, and you're just going to sort of read them little articles saying, well, you can do this because Article 37(2) says you can, or you can't do that because Article whatever. And there isn't this idea that in law, we do research, sort of like the research that was just described in terms of covenants and so on and so forth. There's this idea that all we do is interpret legislation, and that's it. That's our role in life. That's how we're seen by other faculties. And so so we're in an interdisciplinary setting, and when you sort of raise your hand to contribute, you are looked at quite often like, we're not sure why you're in this dialogue, but you are, and we can't understand why you're contributing here, because what we're talking about is the impact of deworming medication on farms on soil health. And you're sitting there and you're like, well, actually, I have quite a bit to say on this topic, because first of all, public policy passes usually by the public policy legal people. So if your issue is that there is a problem with the deworming meds that are going into the cattle that is then going into the soil that is causing issues, well, I have something to say to that. And so that was one of the projects. So the global project was, how do we regulate antibiotic use on farms? And so, and then it somehow ended up in this deworming medications and so on and so forth. And what came out of that is, in fact, the deworming medications tend, and as well as the antibiotics, tend to actually kind of obliterate the biome in the poop that comes out of the cow, which is absolutely necessary, that biome, those microorganisms, to have healthy soil. Well, you need to have healthy soil in order to have soil that can then act as a carbon sink. So you can link it right back to the capacity for soil to absorb a carbon because of all these other steps. And another project, which goes right back to the presentation we had on covenants, was a chair that we had at McGill, an interdisciplinary research chair that was funded by the government of Quebec. So the Ministry of Environment, Fight Against Climate Change, Wildlife, and Parks. And in English, it sounds as though they're fighting against climate change, they're fighting against wildlife, and fighting against parks, but it's just the English translation that doesn't work very well. The idea is you fight against climate change, but you help wildlife and parks. And what the project was to look at conservation in private lands in Quebec. And that's where I was incredibly sort of, it really came into focus, this debate with regards to climate change, because we had all these various ateliers, these workshops, and we had all sorts of populations represented. And even within the landowner populations, the opinions were so incredibly diverse. So the maple syrup growers, which was mostly in a forest setting, had a totally different perspective on this than, let's say, the farmers that are doing this commercially, as opposed to the hobby farmers that are doing this because, well, they just like to do, but that they have a day job, as opposed to other various landholders that the land use is variable depending on what they use. And then you juxtapose that with all the environmental groups that work in the area, the public policy, the municipalities, et cetera, and you have a completely very diverse ideas about how climate change governance is supposed to happen. And that is something that is, yes, it's in research academic projects, but I'm seeing it also, that diversity and dialogue within the university setting in and of itself, where we are discussing really between academics, between researchers, and of course the student body. And that is something that we need to sort of pay attention to, because you do not want to end up in a situation where you take that middle ground population that is quite concerned about climate change, that is quite concerned about what is going on and our capacity to adapt and figure out how to deal with these problems. And we don't want to have this happen, where the population tends to gravitate towards one extreme or the other, because then that dialogue becomes more and more difficult to happen. So we want to keep that population that is concerned, but has a divergent way of thinking about climate change in that middle ground, so we can keep having these discussions that then can move us forward, rather than having these discussions that ends up being status quo, because there is no overlapping ideas in which that we can build on. And to sort of finish, in my opinion, you know, so many of the entities that we're talking about today pass through universities. Whether you're a CEO, whether you are a farmer, whether you are a landholder of whatever kind, so many of these populations pass through universities. And universities is sort of a place where we have the possibility to impact how that dialogue happens. So does the dialogue happen in a purposeful, useful, contributory conciliatory way so that it contributes to the betterment of this problem? Or do we just contribute to the creation of these sort of extremes points of view that, in my opinion, don't in any way, shape, or form advance the issue of climate governance in a positive way, which we absolutely need to do, because we kind of, need to take this seriously and kind of move at a bit of a faster pace and a more efficient, effective way to build this climate governance. Thank you.
We just show up. Why did you do anything?
No, does he have slides?
No, well, just like whatever was.
Can you sorry, Chris, we're just trying to figure out how to make you prominent on.
Oh, there we go, yeah.
Travis. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Professors Souquet and Choudhury, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to see my fellow panelists and to hear from them. So is my slide up? Not that it's that important, but I'm just very proud of that photo. If it isn't, it doesn't matter. I just can't see it. It doesn't matter. Venetia.
I'm scared we're gonna like end the meeting.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. It's a just know that it's a fantastic picture that I took. In fact, the only good picture I've ever taken. And it's a picture of Detroit, a city which I can see from my window here in Windsor. And I do a lot of thinking about borders and border diplomacy and city diplomacy because of where I live and the sort of borderlands that people here negotiate on a regular basis. And it's that international angle that I come at this question of climate change, and in particular an interest in city diplomacy and cities as international law actors. I've entitled my talk that the lights are much brighter here. And that, of course, comes from the 1964 hit song by Petula Clark, Downtown, when go downtown. And in fact, you can all thank me for the earworm I've now given you for the rest of the day and perhaps the rest of the week. Because my view is that the problems very much are city problems, but the solutions similarly are very much city problems. But when I say, why is climate change a city problem? You'll know that more than half the world's population now lives in cities, and that's projected to rise to 2/3 of the world's population by 2050. That's according to the World Bank. And although cities occupy only 2% of the Earth, they consume roughly 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with transportation and buildings being among the largest contributors. Now, Hassan, in his excellent talk, mentioned the word lifestyle, and I think that's spot on. I want to suggest that many aspects of our lifestyle are baked in terms of carbon use by virtue of zoning, city planning, land use at the municipal level. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But if the problems are city problems, similarly, they provide at least a partial solution. Well, where would the solutions lie? They're manifold. They include land use planning and transportation, which I'm going to talk about, but other issues including urban forests, heat islands, building design standards, municipal fleets, and so on. So there's a wide variety of ways in which cities can be the solutions. But, and again, coming back to this notion of lifestyle, having us shift from car-dependent sprawl patterns to more compact development is needed, but culturally difficult and difficult in terms of policy matters. I think often when we think of cities as having a climate change agenda, we'll think of, municipal buildings have to be made more energy efficient, or municipal fleets need to be electrified or reduced. But really the crux of it is in the bones that we build of cities and the continual emphasis on sprawl, continued emphasis on parking, and the continued emphasis on zoning system, which has not only negative climate impacts, but also impacts on the livability of cities and equity in cities as well. You know, as long as we continue to build cities where walking, cycling, or public transportation is or is seen as infeasible, we'll continue to have cities which are a major part of the problem. And so the solutions are very much within our grasp, and some cities have done them to greater extents than others. Robust transit networks, robust active transit networks, which include small and defined blocks, all the way to installing bike lanes and biking infrastructure, parking design and management. So, you know, the thousands of parking spots that are destined for Ontario Place is not quite what I had in mind, but we can come back to that in other examples. Well, have cities taken up the challenge? To some extent, yes. But what is intriguing is that they've been doing so together with other cities by engaging in climate mitigation and adaptation measures locally, but also by way of city diplomacy and by way of cities as engaging or involving international law actors. Now, the international term for cities is not unprecedented. Of course, one can think of city-states in antiquity, the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, the Hanseatic League, and there's long been an interest in micro-states such as the Vatican City, as well as disputed border cities with a history of unique governments such as Trieste and Danzig. And cities have acted together since 1913, when the Union Internationale des Villes, now United Cities and Local Governments, was put in place. But until relatively recently, these have often been ignored as international law or international relations players. And ignored at least as important international players. I mean, there's activities such as sister city or twin city diplomacy, which I wouldn't want to discount, which are now seen as quaint and sometimes the subject of amusement. And there's a fantastic Parks and Rec episode on twin cities if anyone hasn't seen it. But the local turn in international law, or the urbanization of international law, is a very real thing. The activities of cities have been accompanied by a burgeoning scholarly subfield, including the creation of the International Law Association Committee on Urbanization and International Law. So what have cities been doing? Let me give two examples. The first is climate emergency declarations. So 36 of the 50 largest Canadian cities have made, by population, have declared a climate emergency through city council resolutions. And many of these emergency declarations explicitly or implicitly reference the Paris Accord or other international instruments. Now, I'll speak in a moment about how effective these are, but it's to say for now that climate change has been on cities' agendas, and the internationalization of these city agendas is something to keep an eye on. What's another example? Well, activist city groups at the COPs, the Council of the Parties, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have been very active. 58 Canadian municipalities, large and small, are members, for example, of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And Canada's big city mayors in the C40 are represented at these COPs as well, most recently in Baku, Azerbaijan. So there are examples of cities engaging with climate change, engaging internationally with climate change, but there are a number of problems and obstacles in the way. The first is that cities lack a constitutional mandate to engage in diplomacy in most jurisdictions. In Canada, for example, cities have often been described as the losers at Confederation in 1867, and the Supreme Court of Canada highlighted the lack of constitutional status for municipalities in its decision regarding provincial cuts to the size of Toronto City Council during the 2018 election campaign, where the majority noted that, quote, municipalities are mere creatures of statute who exercise whatever powers through officers appointed by whatever process that provincial legislatures consider fit. And these cities are creatures of statute of another subnational entity, provinces, which themselves have limited and contested abilities to act internationally. Now, I don't want to overstate this challenge, because whatever can be said of what's formally in the Constitution, cities have entered in a wide variety of areas unforeseen by the drafters of Constitution or provincial legislation of municipalities. In other words, generally speaking, cities have been left with scope for free action in international relations, not only on climate change, but on issues such as human development, human rights, and more specifically, sanctuary cities, among other things. Now, that's one challenge, the constitutional status of cities. Another is that it's not so much a challenge, but a fact that actions to date have often been hortatory or limited. So I mentioned a large number of climate emergency declarations, but they often lack teeth. They are often declaratory or hortatory, and they've been clawed back. Many of these were put in place in 2018, 2019, 2020, but they've often been clawed back. So I'll just give you an example of my own city. When the climate emergency declaration was put in place in Windsor, it was required that every administration report to City Council would come with a climate impact statement. Our mayor and council have recently done away with that. Another problem rather, with these climate emergency declarations is that they have again seen climate change as something discrete. Perhaps there's a climate officer or a climate office in the city, but we have yet to mainstream the need for climate change action across land use planning and transportation. Those are difficult things to do. They're psychologically difficult. They're difficult in terms of policy matters. We have overinvested in sprawl so deeply that to peel the layers back on this are not easy. And municipal systems, frankly, are not set up for taking bold action, let alone international governance. Municipalities are affected more than other layers of governments by the importance of incumbency, or the perceived importance of incumbency, the popularity contest aspect of municipal elections, the fact that municipal elections are often not party or platform based. People see their municipal councillors as being there to get their potholes fixed. The low voter turnout, 35% across the country roughly. The new, in Ontario at least, strong mayor powers, which potentially could be good for climate change mitigation and adaptation, but often will have the other effect. But issues of tying together equity, economic development, innovation, right-sizing municipal finances, the culture shift and the policy shift is very difficult. So I don't want to, I want to suggest that while municipalities can and should be part of the solution, none of these things will come easily. As national states during our current populist wave, turn away from climate governance, we need to continue to look at cities. Thus, while cities have no explicit mandate to engage internationally under the current constitutional legislative order, we need to look to them. Some cities have seized on this free zone with imagination and initiative, but others have been more reticent. Former New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg put it this way: while nations talk, cities act. And the challenge for us in Canada is to make our cities act, and not just at the margins, but in terms of some of the more fundamental ways in which we conceive of the way in which we live in, work in, and move around urban environments. So I'll just close by saying that the title of the seminar was Non-State Actors. Cities are not, of course, non-state actors in the formal sense. Cities can cause state responsibility for Canada. Canada ultimately has responsibility for the actions of cities. But nonetheless, in terms of engaging cities, I think in this current populist wave, we're really going to look to them, while the federal and provincial levels of government seem to be on the edge of failing us. So both a mixture of optimism and positivism there, positivity there. But I'll stop. Thank you very much.
My role as discussant, and Chris, we were able to see your picture eventually. If someone was calling the shots and able to do that. I don't know whose phantom person is changing our slides. And so we were able to see your picture, and I don't know what they're doing next. Okay, so my role as discussant, but I am mindful of the time, is that there's not much, or there's like 20 minutes left for questions, but I want to raise a few to the panelists and then open it up for everyone else. So my first question is to Ben and Chris. So one of the obvious situations we're currently experiencing in the world, looking at the California wildfires, what is the role of cities, going to what Chris was speaking about, and Ben, private landholders, when we think about climate change in cities?
first?
Chris.
Go ahead, and, well, I think something.
Sorry, can you hear that?
Go ahead, I can hear it. Go ahead.
Oh, did you want to start then to answer?
Well, look, I mean, I speak from the experience of my own city. So Hobart in 1967 went through what LA is going through now, devastating fires that killed scores of people, scorched 500,000 hectares, destroyed 1,000 homes. Now, when we look at cities, we've got a bit of a conundrum. The problem is that it's insulating people from the natural world. As more and more people live in cities, they have very little experience with nature. Now, fortunately, where I live in Hobart, I have national parks all around me. I can be in one in 10 minutes in my car. We need to have cities bringing nature into cities, meaning forests and wetlands and wildlife. But how do we coexist? Because LA shows that when you have a lot of forests in the realm of cities, you create a very dangerous situation for property, people, and animals. And so I think part of the role of cities is to find not just ways of mitigating the impacts of climate change, which is what Chris was getting at, but also about how we can adapt to climate change in a way that doesn't remove cities from our environment. And in fact, the more forests and green roofs and things we create, we actually also will mitigate climate change. But I don't think, LA's experience showed that there's going to be a lot of pushback against those who want to sort of have reforestation in cities and bring nature into cities. People might want to say, let's clear all the trees and get them out. So there's a climate adaptation issue there that's really significant. That's me.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. And I would just add that, of course, climate change is the culprit here, but the creation of, or the lack, the infrastructural problems have also become really evident. I don't want to sort of echo Trump in saying that, but it's true, right? I mean, even the lack of things like water pressure. And what we're doing is setting ourselves up for failure with sprawl. And of course, there's no city with a greater sprawl problem than LA. But, Canadian municipalities as well, this constant sprawl up to the suburbs, we create financially unsustainable situations for ourselves. You can't, for example, have a robust public transportation network when you are continually sprawling out to the suburbs. And what this means is that basic city services fail rather. So roads, water infrastructure, sewage infrastructure, we can't afford it. We can't afford the sprawl. And at least part of the problem LA is facing right now is the failure of its infrastructural systems. And part of that has to do with sprawl, which is likely directly connected with climate change.
I just quickly have one question for Hassan before I open it up to everyone else. Listening to you talk about corporate accountability, and it almost presented this vision of the corporation as stateless, that belongs everywhere and nowhere, and who gets to regulate. So I was wondering if you look at the work of like Larry Kattenbacher and Pearson and Phantom, when they talk about transnational legal orders, how do we use international law in an effective manner to actually capture corporations and regulate them? Is there any ways, mandatory human rights due diligence, do we actually have faith in that, or what's the transnational way to regulate corporations then?
Yeah, so is there a way for international law to effectively regulate? My colleagues here, Craig Scott, Robert Wye, have written about the migration of norms from the international legal sphere into the domestic legal sphere. Harold Corr has written about the same thing, this transnational legal, migration as well from the international to the domestic. I come back to, and I think this has been discussed when we talk about cities and landowners as well, the need for cultural shifts. If we are able to better place this connection between what corporations do and the impacts it has on the environment. I'll give you one example where an industry that's almost completely deregulated, both internationally and domestically, is shipping, right? If you look at some of the largest carbon emissions in the world come from shipping companies. We still use shipping for much of our transportation today, right? When we look at global supply chains. But it's really kept out of the public eye. So part of this is not necessarily a legal solution. There has to be greater awareness. And if we look at other collective action problems, it's not necessarily legal measures. Just on a completely but analogous note, I was reading, so Malcolm Gladwell came out with the return of the tipping point or something like that. He gives the example in there about LGBTQ rights, where attempts were made, he focuses on the US, particularly in the US, to change laws, to litigate, and for years it wasn't going anywhere, and you had, even with a relatively balanced Supreme Court, you did not have cases. This has been acknowledged outright by conservative politicians, by the litigators who litigated Obergefell at the US Supreme Court, said nothing made more of a difference to normalizing LGBTQ rights within society more than Will and Grace did as a TV show. So culturally, I think climate change is somewhat similar. There's a psychology behind this, that you need to be able to bring it into real life and to humanize and to be able to connect what corporations do. Until you do that, you can have all the domestic and international instruments are really not going to go anywhere.
And I'm happy to open it up for the audience to join in with questions.
Or online.
Yes, virtually as well.
I have a question for Professor Richardson. So hearing you talk about incentives for private landowners through governments or municipalities, it kind of struck me that, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, the city of Mississauga has a program called Blue Boulevards, and essentially the strip of grass between the road and your property, they help pay for you to plant native pollinator plants rather than grass. So that's just an example, but do you think there should be more of a large scale municipal or provincial effort to kind of implement these sort of programs?
Okay, great question. So I can't, my knowledge is a bit rusty on what happens in Ontario, but in Australia, the way to mobilize landowners now into conservation programs is to create markets in biodiversity. So Australia passed the Nature Repair Act in 2023. It's a federal law. And what the law will do is allow landowners who do good things to promote biodiversity, plant trees, restore wetlands, then to get what you might call it a biodiversity credit. They can sell it on an open market, and a corporation might buy it, or a city government might buy it and say, well, we've done some bad stuff to the environment, let's buy this credit to basically offset. Now, offsets is a dodgy arena, you know, it's not like for like. It can mean net loss, not net gain. So, but that's sort of where we are sitting, that either landowners like me, because I was privileged, could buy land to do it altruistically. I didn't care about a bit of a financial hit because it was small anyway. Or you're a farmer who's thinking about the bottom line, and you will not, as we know from empirical studies in Australia, they will not be interested in nature conservation unless it advantages the bottom line. Taxation law can do a lot, capital gains tax, property taxes, land transfer taxes. So I suggest my takeaway for this is all, be attentive to different types of landholders. In the same way, we should be attentive to different types of corporations. You know, there's public corporations, private corporations, multinational corporations. Some businesses take a non-corporate form. That could be a cooperative. So it's this attentiveness to different types of actors, and what are the things that are going to motivate them to take action on climate change or biodiversity, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach is important. But yes, money talks, as the aphorism goes, and it will be important really well. What was the name of the program in Mississauga, did you say?
It's called Blue Boulevards.
Oh, lovely, great.
And it's run by Mississauga residents, but the delay is you have someone come survey the property.
Yeah.
And if you actually have these blooming boulevards, it reduces your flood risk. So
Okay.
for homes that are built on a floodplain, it's encouraged.
Very good, thanks for sharing that.
I have a question for Professor Ahmad, based on what you just said, Professor Richardson, about money talks. And I'm curious if you feel like the culture has to shift in order for us to, for example, address this attribution problem you're talking about. How can we effectively internalize the costs of, let's say, just regular consumer behavior in things like shipping, or the example that I like to think about is fast fashion? How can you internalize the cost of your behavior and its impact on the environment when the main thing that consumers just are ever going to care about is what they're buying and how much they're paying for it? So people are willing to pay more, but often it seems to me they're willing to pay more for, you know, like more products or better products, but they're not necessarily willing to pay for a sustainable product. And sustainability will cost money. So it seemed like, to take your example of Will and Grace, it seems to me that perhaps in that example, for a lot of people, they can maybe try and understand like the experience of someone who is LGBTQ, who is part of the LGBTQ community, but they don't have to really change much of their life to accept changes in the culture. But changes in the culture and consumer behavior, perhaps really hard to swallow it, or at least that's the way it seems to me. So how can we address that?
Yeah, so we have entire regimes that are built up to transfer funds, to shift resources from perceived wrongdoers to harmed individuals, whether that's regulatory regimes. The one that I think is the most, or potentially the most, has the most potential is looking at tort law regimes in private law. So, with the Will and Grace example, let me just say, any effort has to be multifaceted. There has to, and if you look at any kind of social change that's taken place, LGBTQ rights included, in the recent past, they've been multifaceted: legal and non-legal, cultural, psychological, economic, political, so on and so forth. And I think climate change is similar in that regard. But if you're going to change behavior in a serious way, tobacco companies are a good example of this, where you have certain tobacco companies that have been rendered bankrupt, that have changed behavior. We have certain regulations, warnings that have to be put on labels now that came from top down, that came from government. But you also had very sustained litigation projects, not just ad hoc litigation, but you did have sustained group litigation in multiple jurisdictions at the same time that tried to siphon revenues and profits away from corporations to the people who have been harmed. If you go after corporate profits and you can show some success in doing it or get somewhere in the litigation, you will get corporate boards and shareholders to listen, right? I think that is part and parcel of it. When you have what I've called a legislative vacuum or a democratic deficit where you don't have governments acting, well, we do have mechanisms aside from that. We have the courts, we have the ability to litigate these kind of things. And that's what you actually see happening in the climate change realm. You have atmospheric trust litigation in the US, you have litigation all throughout the world, recognizing that if we're really going to change behavior and government's not going to do it for us, there are these other avenues to do so. But I couch all this in saying that it still has to be a multifaceted approach. But the culture shift is not going to siphon revenues. You need the law to do that. You need litigation regimes. You need these private law regimes if government's not going to do it in order to move resources, move funds from one party to another. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
There's another question. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Rob. I've got two questions. One perhaps for the panel in its entirety. And this is not to sort of test the panel, but it's really just helped me to understand. I understand in December that the International Court of Justice went out to various states asking for essentially an advisory opinion on the state's obligations to climate change. So I'm curious as to whether there's anything that we discussed today with respect to non-state actors that would be different or contradictory what the states have, how the states have responded to the ICJ's request for opinions. That's sort of the first question. The second question, and maybe this is more directed to Professor Ahmad, because I'm very interested in your comments about sort of the balance of power between state actors and corporations, and that the solution is not necessarily with government, that we have to look more and more towards corporations. And I'm wondering what your take would be, or what your reaction would be to consider, just through the private realm, whether there should be increased disclosure obligations, whether stakeholders should have more legal entitlement or more legal rights to put pressure on corporations when it comes to climate change. Is that part of the answer as well, that in terms of how we can have more accountability with corporations? So two questions.
anyone want to go first, or you had one directed, I guess, at you?
Sure. I can take the second question. First, I have some thoughts about the first question as well, to be honest. So the balance of powers, stakeholder duties to stakeholders. So just for people who are not in this realm, a corporation, I guess the dominant view or the traditional view has been, when we look at the best interest of the corporation, there's a level of equating that with the best interest of the shareholders or maximizing shareholder profits. This is a debate that goes back about 100 years. That do the board of directors or does the corporation itself conduct itself in a way to maximize share value for the people who actually own the corporation. Now, we're not talking about, closely held corporations or family companies. We're talking about, it doesn't have to be a public company, but a company that has shareholders. Who are you, who do you act for? Shareholders, or the stakeholder model is, should you conduct yourself in a way or make decisions that benefits consumers, employees, the environment, adjacent communities, so on and so forth. I think, yeah, that is part of the issue to revamp corporate purpose. We were talking about before the panel bill, what is it, S285, about having a broader corporate purpose. I have a project that's ongoing right now about using litigation to actually revamp corporate purpose. I think this is part of it. You have to alter the underlying structure of how the corporation functions from a shareholder to a stakeholder model. I'm not the only one advocating for this. There's a lot of people advocating for this. If corporations do not necessarily have to make decisions or cannot be held liable for conduct and decision that harms the environment as well as other stakeholders, then they're not going to be forced to change their behavior. And so I think this is, again, the psychology of corporate decision making. How do you actually modify behavior? Litigation is one way to do that. Now, I would say the ideal way is to have legislation, to have government come together, but that's very difficult because you have a political economy. There have been attempts, you can take Canada as one example, I can cite you other jurisdictions, but Canada, there have been so many attempts to pass international human rights based laws holding corporations accountable for their actions overseas. They go nowhere. They've gone nowhere for the past 30 years. Peter Julian out of BC tries to introduce private members bills. They have sat there. There have been attempts to amend the Federal Courts Act. Government action is hard. But I think this is where, again, the culture shift, but also the place for litigation. We have independent courts in Canada and other developed countries that have actually made a difference when, I cite to students, it's not a corporate related example, but, as much as people will say in 2025 that, Indigenous rights were on our mind, it was not on our mind 20 years ago, until and when you had serious class action litigation that was commenced in Ontario and other provinces and federally. That's when it entered the fold. So again, multifaceted solutions, I think, are best pursued because they work off of each other. Culture shifts happen when you have the courts that are called upon to make a difference as well. And there's a confluence in these avenues. But I think you're absolutely right. There has to be more of a stakeholder model. I'll quickly say, and I'll let other people chime in about the ICJ. I teach climate change law here, a seminar. Somebody asked me about this last week. And I probably said it flippantly, but I do still hold this opinion that it really doesn't matter. Nobody's going to care about the ICJ's opinion. Anyone can feel free to disagree about this, that nobody cares. I used to work at the International Criminal Court, and I used to literally think working there is like, nothing's happening here. And everybody gets paid a lot. And the ICJ is the same. The structure of the United Nations, of the ICJ, the unenforceability of these decisions, not just in climate change, but in all other realms, nobody's listening. And that is how I really feel about that.
So I see Konstantia has raised her hand, and then Chris to answer the first question. Can we let Konstantia go first? I guess I just saw hers first.
I'm not sure it's first or second or a combination of the two, but it's just to mention that that universities have tended to not participate as much as there's an internal issue of dialogue. There's also an external issue of dialogue because universities as non-state actors could in fact collectively make a presentation concerning climate change issues on a number of international fora, since there is simply so many of them and they represent a significant portion of the population. But the other thing that's really interesting about universities is that universities are significant landholders. They collectively, and often it's in an urban setting. So if we just take Montreal, for instance, where you have Université de Montréal on one side of the mountain, McGill on the other side of the mountain, there's maybe like just a couple of things between the two. Effectively, the entire mountain, if some were to sit down and have a conversation, we could have some, serious conservation situation happening, but that conversation has in 150 years never taken place, and I don't see it actually taking place in the near future. But we have to understand that universities collectively, in terms of the amount of land, in terms of land use, in terms of their position as sort of a reservoir of a lot of this scientific research that goes out and feeds the population with regards to where we are with climate change and other issues, do have this authority, if you will, and they could, if they wanted to, use it to go forth in international forum, whether it's a sort of a submission to the ICJ or into other international institutions that make a lot of decisions with regards to international sort of policy on these issues.
And I think Chris had his hand up.
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, I don't know what the ICJ will say, but I suspect they'll say what other courts have said, international courts and tribunals have said on this issue with respect to non-state actors. The advisory opinion will be directed to states, and they'll say they'll say something like there's a due diligence requirement to put in place a regime which mitigates and adapts climate change, and so it'll be up to each state to put in place regimes to cover, for example, shipping and transportation and so on, other forms of transportation which might affect the marine environment. So I suspect if the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea's advisory opinion, which was released last year, is any guide, we'll see implications for non-state actors, but via the state. I probably take a little bit, although I enjoyed it, I probably take a little bit less of a cynical view than Hassan on this, although I respect his opinion on it. I mean, it is meant to be an advisory opinion, not a decision. But I do think it goes, if nothing else, to the question of changing the norms, changing the legal culture, changing the psychology. However much it's not as effective as I would certainly like it to be. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Oh, I would be similar to Chris's view. I think it can help change the social license of non-state actors. It can shift the sort of culture. So the fossil fuel divestment movement, I think, is one of the best areas of action in the private sector. And they can look at something like this and say, well, here's a further reason why we can undermine those who want to resist divestment, which is also, coming back to Konstantia, very important for the role of universities. They're at the epicenter of the campaigns. But like, the other view we have on the table here is that, yes, a lot of this is just talk and it goes nowhere. And so we have to balance. We need action.
So I think we've actually reached time. So I'm going to end it here and say thank you very much to all of our panelists. And thank you very much to Venetia for organizing all of this. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pity we didn't have you talking.